This is the book that I would have loved for someone to put into my hands in the midst of my darkest seasons and say, this is some encouragement. It's full of scripture. Look up these scriptures, listen to the word of God, and look at how this is applied and how it can apply to your dark season. So I really wrote the book that I needed during that season.
Welcome to the Sacred Hustle podcast, where we embrace the beauty of balancing purpose, peace, and pursuit in a faith-filled life. This is the place where quiet moments of reflection meet bold steps of obedience, and where stories of resilience, grace, and unwavering hope come alive. Whether you're here to reignite your purpose, find encouragement, or simply pause in the midst of life's hustle, you're in the right place. Let's lean into the sacred together, because every step of your journey matters. Hello, friends. I'm so glad that you're here today for this episode of the Sacred Hustle podcast, where we dive deep into bold conversations about faith, purpose, and the sacred hustle of how we pursue a deeper relationship with God. I'm excited to sit down with our guests today, and especially because we are coming into a season of both joy, and it can be also a season of sadness for many. And as we are getting close to Christmas, and maybe you're doing all of the things, and it's just, you feel like the whole year is just a flash before your eyes at this point, I want to encourage you to make sure that you're taking time to pause and reflect on the true meanings and gifts of the season. And today we're going to sit down with my friends Dustin and Rebecca George and talking about Dustin's new book that just came out. And we're going to talk a little bit about what it looks like before the dawn, knowing God's presence in the dark seasons of life. If any of you guys can relate to what it looks like to go through a dark season, I know you're going to want to stick around for this episode and this sweet conversation between husband and wife and how they've been able to encourage each other during their own dark seasons. This is just such a sweet time of conversation and getting to know their wisdom and perspective on what it looks like. And we'll also hear the story of how Before Dawn came to be. So pull up a chair, relax, grab your favorite cup of tea, coffee, whatever that looks like, and get ready to just dive deep into a beautiful time of reflection and time in God's presence. Let's get to it, friends. Well, friends, welcome to another episode of The Sacred Hustle. I'm so glad you're here. I'm your host, Rachel Earp, and I have my friends today, Dustin and Rebecca George. Just the cutest couple. I'm so excited I could bring them together in this conversation. We're going to talk about a lot of things, one of them being a brand new book that just got put out into the world. But before we get to that, Dustin and Rebecca, welcome to the show. I'm so glad you could come on today.
Rachel, thank you so much for having us. This is fun. We've spent time together in person, all three of us, and now it's fun to just get to share time with your listeners. So thanks for having us.
Oh my gosh, yes. I've been so excited. So here's the thing that I really want to start out with, because I love to know people's stories, and I know you both as a couple have such a beautiful story. I would love for our listeners who are just getting to know you for the first time, who you both are, how did you guys come together, and let's just start there. Let's get into the fun stuff.
Okay.
I feel like I always tell our story, so I want you to tell it.
Okay.
Let's get your version.
Well, let's I'll tell you what, let's start with us individually and then us together. How's that? Very briefly. Does that sound good?
Sure.
So I'm a Mississippi native and grew up in the hills of East Mississippi. And my family, way back in the 1800s, moved to Mississippi from Tennessee. And so after growing up down there and serving as a teacher, I worked as a teacher for about 3 years or so. I moved back to Tennessee, I guess my long-term or long-time ancestral area. So I moved back to Tennessee. and taught for a number of years, taught for 7 more years. And while I was teaching, got involved in a local church here in East Tennessee. And then after those 10 years of teaching total, I became a pastor on staff. And so I served in various capacities there. And while I was serving there at that church, I met Rebecca, and she was a volunteer in one of the ministries where I was working. And we had a nodding acquaintance. We were friends, acquaintances, but we didn't date or anything like that. And then God called me to go back to Mississippi, to the other side of the state. I was at a church there, became their lead pastor. And while I was there serving as lead pastor, Rebecca and I reconnected. And do you want to pick up with your pick up with your lead up to that moment?
Yeah, I can, and then I'll toss it back to you. So I am a Tennessee gal, have been my whole life. I grew up here on the northeast side of the state, about a couple hours from where we live now. Rachel, you know, because we've spent time together in person. And so grew up and finished high school there and went to the University of Tennessee. And while I was in school, kind of finding my own church family for the first time, I'd been raised in church and came to Christ when I was about 10 years old. But, you know, when you're in college, that's kind of your first time of figuring out, like, hey, God, where are you leading me, and what church community would you have me be involved in? And so I got plugged into the college ministry at the church Dustin described a moment ago that we met at, and got super involved in college ministry, led a small group, taught a class in children's ministry, kind of in the season of my life in college. And then post college, I stayed around in Knoxville and was super involved there. And we met in that season, but like Dustin said, we reconnected after he was in Mississippi on Instagram. You never know where you're going to meet your spouse.
That's true.
So I'll toss it back to you.
So what many people do not know is that after, you know, I had been single. I mean, all my life. I mean, you know, up until Rebecca. I mean, I dated people, but everybody was saying, when are you going to get married? And I was like, well, you know, God just hasn't connected me with the right person yet, despite years and years and years of praying. And I even wrote a blog post about how to pray for your future wife. And I had all of these things that I was praying. And then, so I'd been praying through that. And one evening, and we don't tell this story much.
No, this is fun. I know where you're headed, and we don't tell this a lot. I love it.
One evening, I could not sleep, and it was late at night, and I was scrolling through Instagram, and I came across a video of Rebecca, and she is very active on Instagram, and she knows how to put together. She knows how to put together videos, and she just very compelling, very concise, unlike me most of the time. But so I'm watching this video, and she's talking about a ministry she had started, and she's talking about it. She's so passionate, and I just lay there and just watched this video, and then I watched it again, and I watched it again, and I thought, wow, Lord, you know, is this potentially the person? Because I can really see this, because she is absolutely just, and I knew her reputation anyway, but the more I watched and the more I listened, I thought, wow, this woman is a powerhouse. I need to know her more. And so I didn't know how to break through that. I mean, how do you contact somebody and say, hey, watching your video, and I'm thinking, because also at the time, I am 8 hours away. Right, I'm
from
East Tennessee. So she is in East Tennessee. I am in Mississippi, and we had just been kind of touch and go, just following each other on Instagram. And I'm thinking, how do you do this? So I prayed about it, and this sounds, in retrospect, to some people, it sounds terrible, but I was sold out in what she was doing that I made a donation to her ministry. And I thought, well, maybe that will, you know, I want to help her regardless, right? Because I'm just so sold out on this. And it ended up she was going to St. Jude. She was going to drive across the state from Knoxville and go over to Memphis to St. Jude. She was going over there for an event and involved with her ministry. And I just sent her a message, and we were back and forth. And I said, we could, when you're in Memphis, I mean, I could come up and we could grab dinner and coffee or something. And she's like, yeah, that'd be great. And then she went home and looked it up, like where I was, and you realized what?
Well, I was talking to a friend because, on my side, it's like, okay, I think I'm going on a date with this guy that I've known forever, that I've thought the world of, but I never considered that God might have something here.
Mhm.
And I had done the math on Google Maps of, okay, he's 4 hours away from
He's
Memphis.
driving 4 hours from coffee.
I remember a friend just looking at me and saying, yeah, there's more to this, because no guy would drive 4 hours to just take you to coffee. So
Mhm.
Well, we did have barbecue. So
we did. We had great
Aw.
barbecue.
We had
too.
barbecue
Yeah,
in
we spent the
Memphis.
whole day together. It was great.
So that's a given.
Aw.
So from there, we hung out and we kept communicating. And then shortly thereafter, I mean, we dated long distance. And so we were talking every day and communicating and praying with each other and talking to each other. And then very shortly thereafter, we got engaged and got married. She moved down to Mississippi. And then after being there for a few years, God called us back to East Tennessee. And so that's where we are. That's where we are today.
Oh my goodness. What a sweet story.
So that's the whirlwind tour. There are more details, but that's the whirlwind
there's always
tour.
the extra details, like,
Sure.
that just makes the story even sweeter. But I love, I think it's the unique thing about stories, especially, and I always love to hear how couples in particularly find each other, because it is so unique. There is no same story. And when you're able to look back and reflect, and at the time you don't even realize how God is navigating you. And it's like the timing, when everything falls into alignment and the timing is right, which that waiting period can feel very hard. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of people can relate to the time of waiting, where that can just feel like the longest season. And, God, of course, sees the bigger picture. He knows, He's ordained everything, but that waiting is so hard. So as you guys were both waiting, and I know you mentioned, Dustin, earlier that, you get the questions, when are you going to get married? And, when are you going to find your person? How did you guys kind of navigate those questions with whether family, friends? As we're recording this, we're going into the holidays. So I know for me, when I was in that stage of life, I had so many aunts and uncles, and it's like, I'm a little stressed out going to this, family dinner or whatever. How did that look like for you guys?
Yeah.
Well, actually, you actually wrote something recently. That's
I'm
a
about to
perfect-
release
it's like a-
something that I know I read the gals at camp a little bit of this book that releases for me in the spring, but I write a lot about that in my next book. It's called You're Not Too Late, Trusting God's Timing in a Hurry Up World, which is exactly what you're describing, right?
Yeah.
How do we navigate those moments where we have a longing in our hearts, often something that's God-given, like a desire for marriage, and yet we're being asked all the time, when are you getting married? Are you dating anybody? When are you going to have kids? And the reality is, what I have found, and I think I began to discover this when I was single, is that never really ends, right? Because I would be single being asked the questions of, oh, are you seeing anybody? Oh, when are you going to get married? But then I would look across the table at my friend who got married a year ago, and those same the same questions that make something bubble up in our hearts were coming to them in a, when are you going to have kids kind of way.
Yeah.
Right. And so I began to see that. And I think it helped me in a way kind of make peace with, okay, this is going to happen in God's timing. And I trust that, even though that might be difficult in certain moments. But, most times those questions don't come out of ill intent.
Right.
Many times it's kind of the only thing maybe somebody knows to ask about your life.
Yeah.
So I think we can give other people grace for that around the holiday table or around the table at a birthday party or whatever. But at the same time, not have shame over the season that God's placed us in, to not feel guilt that that's not maybe what our story looks like today. And so I wouldn't say at all that I did that perfectly. I left many a conversation frustrated or mad about, like, man, I just wish people would quit asking me this. But those are maybe some things that I saw along the way that helped me. So.
And I had
and man, he was a single pastor. So let's just take a moment of silence for that.
Yeah.
And the questions that come along with that.
Sure. So. and the church there, it was a very unique experience in that I can think of a handful of churches. Now, I'm sure there are many more, but I can only think of a handful of churches that hired someone who was single and was not dating or engaged to anyone at the time. And I actually had a person question that. He said, "Well, do you think you can be an effective pastor and still be, and be single?" And I said, "Well, we could take that up with Paul, because Paul was single, and we could, And they said, "Well, I don't know if a single person should be the pastor of a church." And I said, "Well, then you've eliminated Paul. You've also eliminated Jesus actually being a leader. So that's a pretty big indicator." Someone actually said to me, I was going to teach through the book of Ephesians, and I was going to teach on marriage. I was teaching a marriage series, and this was before I was married. And someone said, "How is it that you're going to speak with authority on marriage?" And I said, "Well, it's not my authority. It's the authority of the Word of God. It's God's authority." And one of my friends said, "So Paul wrote that." And I said, "Well, yeah, you know that in Ephesians, you know Paul wrote it." He said, "Yeah, I know. And he's saying that we should live like Jesus." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "So basically you're a single guy telling everybody what another single guy wrote about living like another single guy." And I said, "Yeah, actually." And you talk about the waiting. One of the things at the end of that time, as I mentioned earlier, when Rebecca and I reconnected, it happened very quickly from that point on that we were engaged and we were getting married. And someone said, "Do you think you've waited long enough?" And I said, they said, "Because you just started." And I said, "I have waited for 45 years. It's not, this has not been a slow thing." And one of the beautiful things about this, I'm mindful of one of my friends. He very nonchalantly said something years ago that I wrote down. He said, "With God, things happen all of a sudden, no matter how long it takes." And that really bears out in our relationship, that we waited and we prayed and we waited and we prayed. And then when God began to work, and one of the interesting things was Rebecca's mom was very concerned, because it's like, who is this guy?
Rightfully so.
Sure.
Like, started dating a guy who's a lead pastor, lives 8 hours away from where I live, that she's never met before. And so I remember, and I'm an only child, right? Like, I'm their only kid. So do you want me to tell this part of the story?
Sure. I would love for you to.
Yeah. So I remember even letting her in on, like, hey, while I'm in Memphis at St. Jude, I'm going to have dinner with this guy that I've known for years. He was involved at, my church, and here's kind of his story and whatever. Totally played it cool. Like, it's not a big deal, Mom. I don't know that anything will come of it, but I'm really excited to see him and spend time with him. And when it got more serious, there was kind of this panic of like, oh, wow, this God's really doing something here. And, she absolutely trusted my judgment, but at the same time, it's a massive decision. And so I remember we had kind of a conversation about the whole situation, and she was recounting it to her best friend, who happens to be like life's greatest detective and information finder.
Angela Lansbury.
Yeah.
Columbo.
And so we get off the phone, they get off the phone, and Teese goes and finds Dustin's blog and, is trying to figure out like what information can I find out about this guy. And so she uncovers that blog post that he mentioned at the beginning of the episode about praying for your future spouse or for your future wife. And she read it and called my mom. And I remember my mom recounting this story to me. She said, I was on a walk at the park and I remember the park bench that I sat down on. And I think about it often every time I walk past that park bench. But I sat down and I was talking to my best friend and she said, I'm going to send you a link to this blog. I think you need to read it. And then I think you need to trust your daughter. And so T's pulled up the blog post and read it. And it's beautiful. We'll have to send it to you just to maybe share in the show notes for anybody who's waiting on their spouse. But that was something God used, I think, for sure in our story along the way.
Something written years and years and years earlier. So. And yet, again, it's in the waiting. And this is what I was praying.
Yeah.
And then God used that to reassure my future now mother-in-law and in-laws that he was in this.
Right.
So it's such a beautiful thing.
It is. That's amazing. And here, who would have thought as you were writing this blog post that, that would be such a little piece of how everything would come together with Rebecca. That's so neat. I love that so much. What a sweet story. Oh my God.
All the things that you never knew about our story.
Yes, it's so good. So good. This is great. Well, speaking of story, Dustin, I know you just had a book come out. And
yes,
I'll
indeed.
read the title of the book. It's called Before Dawn, Knowing God's Presence in the Dark Seasons of Life. And I was so intrigued by this book because I feel like when it comes to books in many different genres, we tend to gravitate towards the happy, the positive, the joyful, but you chose to write a book about the hard things. So I would love for you to share what inspired you to write this book? How did it come about? And why did you choose to write about those dark seasons?
Sure. Well, I mentioned the blog, and I had been blogging I've been writing ever since I was a kid. Blogging, I had lots of notes. I had taught lessons. I had taught Sunday school classes. I had taught Bible studies. And I had all of these notes. And one of the things that kept emerging was that at any given moment, I was noticing as I would speak to people and I would just kind of spend time with people that I found that in any given moment, there seems to be far more people walking through a valley than there are on the mountaintop, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was thinking about that. And then I went through, I've been through, not only as a pastor, as a person, but especially as a pastor, the last 20 years serving on pastoral staff, you have an up-close, personal, front row view of people's pain, of people's suffering. You are constantly in the presence of death or near death, of sin, of struggle, of strife within families or relationships, or personal anxieties and worries and doubts. And I had also worked when I started full-time church ministry. I worked for a number of years in counseling ministry, and I still do some counseling. But you are continually seeing, it's like the ER, right? No one wanders into the ER and says, "Hey, everything's fine. Just want to let everybody know." They come to the ER, something's terribly wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And so, not only out of the things that I saw, just out of my own dark seasons. Someone asked a few weeks ago, they said, "How long did it take you to write this book?" And I said, I had figured out and calculated the number of days it took, not consecutive, but cumulative. And to do the first draft, it was 21 days. And people were saying, "Wow, 21 days, you cranked this out." And I said, "Yeah, but I had all these notes and I had all of these thoughts. And really, it's more like 20 years worth of prep to get to those 21 days of actually compiling and writing."
Right.
And so it was out of my own dark seasons. And Bob Goff said or once, you should write the book that you need. And I would put a little qualifier on that and say, this is the book that not only, yes, I need in seasons now, but this is the book that I would have loved for someone to put into my hands in the midst of my darkest seasons and say, this is some encouragement. It's full of scripture. Look up these scriptures, listen to the word of God, and look at how this is applied and how it can apply to your dark season. So I really wrote the book that I needed during that season.
And it's been so wild to see. I mean, the book's been out 6 weeks or so.
Mhm.
It's been wild to see how many instances God has used where we've come along somebody in our life or we've met somebody who needs this message. And isn't that what we do this work for, right? Like,
Yeah.
but to see examples of how God wants to use it, we don't always get to see the fruit of the writing work we do or know how every podcast we record touches the lives of our listeners. So it's a gift when God grants us that inside look at what he's doing. But even last weekend, I had a speaking event and a lady, the event organizer was telling me about a lady in their ministry who was unable to make it that night, but she shared her story with me. And I won't go into the details, but had just walked through an incredible amount of suffering in the last couple of years. And all night long, the Holy Spirit was just like, you just need to give her a book. You just need to give her a book to give to this woman.
Yeah.
And so I was able to do that before I left. And so that's what I love about book writing, Rachel, is, we're able to I think encapsulate something God has taught us or shown us over the years, 20 years, as Dustin described, but to multiply its impact in a way that doesn't require his physical presence. So my physical presence or your physical presence.
Yeah.
And that's really a gift. So it's been cool to see God use it.
That's one of the things that I love about, when you write, especially when you're writing a book of that type of discernment and depth. There's a lot of your heart that goes into it. And it's essentially your gift to the world. It's a very special, part of you that goes into writing. Hey friends, sliding in super quick to show you my favorite thing right now. I love to talk about my favorite things, and that is my phone case from Wally. One of the things that I love about Wally phone cases is the strap right here is sewn in beautifully. It's got a little pocket for your credit card, your business card, or whatever the thing is, and it just feels so beautiful. It's made of this just gorgeous leather feel. And Wally gives back. And I love supporting small businesses. Wally is a business that is husband and wife owned, which is very special to me since my husband and I also own businesses. And they give back to special causes. They always share the initiatives and what it's all about. And it's an adorable couple that just wanted to do something together. And they always have new and beautiful phone covers that come out for different seasons. They are just so comfortable. You can get different accessories for them, and it's my current obsession, so I had to share it. If you check the link in the show notes, click on the link and put in my special discount code, and you will save 10% off your Wally phone case. So I want to encourage you to check them out. There's no other case you'll ever find that's like Wally. And let me know if you do. Tag me on Instagram and show me your Wally case. That would just make my day. So check it out. Let me know what you think and go get yourself a Wally. So, Rebecca, this question is for you.
Okay.
As a spouse, how have you supported Dustin during the dark seasons of his life? And how did you guys make your partnership work through those challenging times? Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like?
Sure, absolutely. So we got married in May of 2019. So if listeners kind of mentally do the math, that's about 10 months before the world shut down. And as we mentioned, I moved to Mississippi after we got married. And so was a new pastor's wife, was a new wife, period, in that season for sure. So within our first year of marriage, my husband was leading a church through a global pandemic that nobody knew how to navigate. Right. So talk about a dark season of life in your first year of marriage. And so, I mean, I think the most important thing to say would be that I think we've done it imperfectly, but trusting God in the process of that, and just really figuring out how we can love one another well. And that looks different for me than I think it looks for him, and how I want to be supported or loved looks different from the way that he wants to be supported or loved. I'm sure if we had time,
Yeah.
Rachel, you could probably describe the same for your
Yeah.
marriage, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's something that we're always this side of heaven going to be growing in as we become one with our spouse. Something that you said to me and had really stuck with you, just marriage advice before we got married. I think about it all the time. We become one when you walk down the aisle and you exchange vows and you do all that on your wedding day. But oneness, the actual practice of oneness, becoming one, that takes a lifetime. Right. And so that's forged through difficult seasons of suffering. That's forged through joyful seasons where you're getting to celebrate one another. And I think it's all a part of the process. So I don't know. What would you add to that?
And I remember before we got married, I had a couple of people say, well, just so you know, these
Yes.
that wise counsel. I'm going to put that in air quotes
Yes.
for our video viewer. The wise counsel. Well, just so you know, and it doesn't get any easier than that first year of marriage. And somewhere in that first year, quarantine, we're trying to do remote church and all sorts of other stuff. And, and I'm thinking, this is as good as this is going to be. Like, what?
I mean, I think I can speak for both of us and say, like, marriage has only gotten better for us.
Yes.
Like in our story, like I have a lot of friends and I love them dearly who say, our first year of marriage, it just felt like I was having a slumber party with my best friend every night.
Yeah.
And I just remember looking at them and saying, I relate to absolutely none of that. Like, I love him.
Yeah.
I love him more than life itself.
Yeah.
But our first year of marriage was I believe it was our hardest year, and it's only gotten better. And I hope that gives some couples hope who might be listening, walking through a hard season.
Well, and as Rebecca mentioned, you first time wife, first time husband, right? We're both very independent, which is great. And it's a wonderful thing. I don't think either we have a healthy dependence on each other, and we are, we cooperate and we look to each other for support and the whole nine yards. But at the same time, neither of us are needy people, right? We need each other, but neither of us are needy,
right?
Which is wonderful.
Yes.
But then you have the pressures of the first year of marriage, plus the pressures of being this couple where I'm the lead pastor, and there are all those expectations that get thrown at you and thrown at a family and ministry. And then on top of that, you just have all the general pressures of leading a church. And then you have a pandemic atop that. And then you're trying to navigate, this new way, regardless of how, anybody viewed the pandemic. It was very disruptive.
Oh, yeah.
And so we ended up spending a great deal of time together. And so it wasn't a matter of, okay, well, we're going to have, and I hate to say, we're going to have a break from each other. One of us is going to go here and one of us is going to go work. No, I mean, we were always together. And so we didn't have any sort of option other than, if there's a disagreement, if there's something we need to talk about, well, we've got all the time in the world to deal with this, right?
Let's just do this. I love it.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. And
exactly.
and within marriages, even, talking about, dark seasons, I think most of us can relate to periods of time where we feel like we're navigating through that as a couple, even, not including what we go through individually.
Sure.
And it's so funny because my husband and I have such a very similar story. We lived states away. I was in Indiana. My husband was in Pennsylvania. when we met, and we had a very non-traditional, unconventional way that we met, actually through my first book that I have published. I was 19 when I published it, and I met him when I was 20. And we started out just as friends, literally not romantically interested whatsoever. It was just we had Bible studies over the phone. We'd write letters back when writing letters was a thing, and had a very quick, met each other. He drove, speaking of driving to a coffee shop, that's the first time where we met, was a coffee shop. He drove all the way from Pennsylvania. He's from Philly to Indiana.
How far is that?
It's over 1,000 miles.
Wow.
Yeah, it's
you knew he was into you.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I was just, when you were saying that, like, who drive, like, I think this is serious,
Yeah.
I only drove 4 hours. I mean,
right?
this guy, my hat is off to him.
I know.
Yeah.
And I remember when I walked into the coffee shop, I knew what he looked like at this point, because we had, we saw pictures of each other, but
sure.
I walked in and I didn't see him. I scanned the whole room. I thought, oh, he chickened out. He didn't come. It was too far. I was just like, and then there was this like pillar in the coffee shop, and the pillar had hid him from my view, and he walked around, and then I was like, wow. And it's interesting when I love the stories of friendship first, because that's how I can relate to that, because I had told him at one point that I'm praying that God will bring you a wonderful wife, like not thinking it would ever be me.
Yeah.
And, when I look back at that and remember, just loving him as a sister, and then it just became so much more, that friendship has sustained us through so many dark seasons, and we'll be 15 years in May.
Wow. Congratulations.
And I remember the questions, people asking, like, didn't you, like, why are you guys rushing into this? And are you doing the right thing? And we went through lots and lots of challenges. Like, it was very lonely. And, those dark seasons, though, sometimes those are actually the seasons that make you stronger as a couple.
Yeah.
That bring you together. And so I love that, that your experience was, that God has done the same for you guys. That's inspiring. And I hope for anyone who's listening that maybe they're in that season in their marriage, whether you've just gotten married or, you've been in it for a while, there's a rhythm and a flow. There's an ebb and a flow to all the different things that we go through in life. So I love that so much. And I'd love to know also, how do you guys both encourage each other during those dark seasons? I know, Dustin, you mentioned in the book title about knowing his presence.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that, because oftentimes when we're going through dark seasons, we cry out to God and we just want him to answer. We just want him to take it all away, like snap, hey, God, you can do this. You can totally make this gone, and when that doesn't happen, and sometimes we pray and there's just silence. And those are really hard moments where you ask, like, God, are you still there? Yeah. So when you're going through that, and I'd love to hear both of your guys' perspective.
Sure.
When you're seeing someone, whether it's your spouse or someone you know and you love, or just someone you've encountered in church, like you were saying, how do you encourage other people that are going through that?
Sure. You want to start?
You can start.
Okay. One of I mentioned that in the book, the idea of when God is silent. There's an old term for God way back. There's a Latin term for it, but it's translated the God who hides himself. That sometimes it seems like you're crying out to God. And you find this in the writings of the psalmists. You find this in Job. There are those verses where someone is crying out and saying, God, where are you? God, why don't you answer me? God, don't be far from me. God, in the book of Job, Job cries out and he says, I'm crying out and you just look at me. And so those moments can be so disconcerting, because this God that we know, according to his word, will never leave us or forsake us, sometimes feels so incredibly distant, although he isn't. And so in those moments of silence, those are those moments where we cultivate that understanding and that deeper faith and that trust that God is indeed there. And then he's working behind the scenes, maybe unseen by us, but nevertheless, very much truly working behind the scenes to accomplish his eternal purpose and his plan, even in our day-to-day moments of life. And so within that, I remember there was a time long before I met Rebecca, I was praying through some things, and it just did not seem like God was doing anything in those situations. And I prayed and I prayed and I prayed. And I remember one day I was praying and I thought, I will think back, kind of taking a biblical cue from some of the psalmists writing. I was going to think back and try to think of a time, did God ever fail me? I'm going to think back and see, when did God ever fail me? And the more I thought about it, I realized, God's never failed me. No matter what I went through, ultimately, I can look back and say, God never failed me. And I began to thank him for that. And I was just saying, God, thank you for never failing me. And in that moment, I fell under such conviction. And then I realized, okay, that is so self-centered. God has never failed me, true. But God has never failed, period. And that was a transformative moment for me, because I could look back and say, yes, God never failed me. God's never failed, never, ever failed in any shape, form, or fashion, in any circumstance or situation. God has never failed. And so offering that encouragement that no matter what a person is going through, God is eternally faithful. We are a part of his eternal plan and purpose. It's not the other way around. It's not, I have a plan and a purpose, and how does God fit into my plan? That is the wrong approach.
Yeah.
We are a part of God's eternal redemptive plan. And so looking at it from that perspective, and that means even our pain can have purpose, and even our suffering can have meaning. And even if it's to draw us closer to him, so we know him more deeply, we trust him more fully, there is a purpose behind even the most difficult season that we might go through.
And I think that's so good. And I think what I would add is, as a spouse, how do we encourage one another in that, in pointing the other back to truth? I think it's natural that we just want to fix it, right? Like, I would do anything in the world to prevent him from experiencing pain. I would do anything in the world to undo whatever has hurt him or disappointed him or frustrated him. And that's frankly not our job, right?
Right.
We live in the midst of a extraordinarily broken world, more broken than ever, in my opinion. And so as we walk through life with another imperfect person in the middle of a broken world, we get to point the other back to truth, and we get to walk alongside and support in that season. But I think that's been a major learning, probably for both of us. I won't speak for you, but you're a fixer as well. And so I think some of the most helpful times when, let's say, I'm in the valley and he's on the mountaintop, or he's in the valley and I'm on the mountaintop, is to just sit and listen. And let the other person have a shoulder to cry on, and to pray for. And I think those are some of the most powerful moments of our relationship. We've just felt seen by the other person.
Sure.
You didn't need me to fix it. I didn't need you to fix it. I just needed you to be there, No,
that's
so
so
I
good.
think that applies in marriage. I think it applies in friendship as well. So
And we will have moments. We laughingly say that nobody, other than Rebecca, nobody hears usually the first version of some of the sermons that I preach, which is probably a good thing, because I will come home and I will be like, oh, there are some crazy, angry little sheep in this flock
Yeah.
that are absolutely some of the most immature.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not talking about a large number, but these are some of the most immature little backbiting sheep I've ever experienced anywhere.
Right.
And then I will say, they need a sermon. And
Yeah.
then Rebecca hears this first
Sweet Rebecca.
version, and Rebecca's looking at me like, oh, like this, he's doing everything but calling down the fire on us on Sunday morning to consume these little problematic sheep.
Oh.
And so, and she'll nod and she's like, yeah, okay, yeah, well, yeah, that's one way you could say it. Yeah. And then it gets tempered, it gets mellowed, and thankfully nobody, and terribly biblical, but just maybe just a little. It's not tempered, and so so she encourages me with that. She also, she's that person that, ministry. The world is a hard place anyway, but then when you're ministering to a difficult, broken world, and you're ministering to some difficult, broken people that just seem to dig their heels in and refuse to change or, grow. Well, it gets exponentially harder. And so, we walk with each other through that. But that's been one of the hardest things, I think. And you can speak to that. That's been one of the hardest things, is navigating when a person who says they're a follower of Christ and who stands or sits and sings on Sunday morning about following Jesus and surrendering and loving him and being part of the family, and then to have them treat me or you in a way that does not indicate that at all.
Yeah.
That's a hard thing to watch.
For sure.
Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah. And I'll respond to that. And I know we're probably running out of time here, but both of us are vocationally in a position where the enemy wants no part of the work that we're doing. We had this conversation just this week, and both of the books that we've written before Dawn, Knowing God's Presence in the Dark Seasons of Life, You're Not Too Late, Trusting God's Timing in a Hurry Up World. Both of these books came at a high cost.
Yes.
For both of us. And also he's vocationally a pastor. And so I would say, to just tie a bow on it, even this week, we have just faced a lot of opposition from the enemy, from just disunity. We've both been sick. It has just been one thing after the other. So talk about like encouraging one another in the valley. I mean, you're catching us on a week where it's just, it's one of those when it rains, it pours kind of weeks for us. But I think it was you that looked at me just a couple days ago and said, like, man, the enemy wants no part of any of this. His book, our Christmas program on Sunday, where the gospel will be clearly presented. Our church had a leak in its roof this week. Like, it is, Rachel, it has literally been nonstop all week. And so I think that's a good example, though, of being able to walk alongside one another and recognize, oh, this is what's at play here, and how can we support and encourage one another and stand by each other in the middle of the chaos. So.
And I think too, like, sometimes out of the dark, when we do come through those dark seasons, oftentimes we enter into the most breathtaking and beautiful break of dawn, like the new season, the new day, whatever that looks like, is, we appreciate it, and we take it all in, and we can just look and just thank God that, hey, I made it through. I survived. It reminds me of a song. Maybe you guys know this song that my grandpa used to sing. I remember hearing it over and over when I was a kid. Hold on, my child, joy comes in the morning. Weeping only lasts for the night. The darkest hour means dawn is just in sight. And I always love to hear him sing that song. And so funny about, when you reflect back, I remember when our youngest son was born, and I don't know, it was about 4 hours after he was born, a whole team of doctors came in, and my husband had just gone home. We lived super far. This was when we lived in New York. So I sent him home. I'm like, you're exhausted. Like he came a month early. So he was, we weren't expecting to have him that day, put it that way.
Yeah.
So he had just went home to sleep and take a nap. And they said, I'm sorry, but we have to life flight your son to another hospital in another state. He's had a massive seizure. And I remember, just telling them I want to see him before you put him on that helicopter. So they wheeled me into this room, and I remember he was like in this incubator with all these wires and things and tubes, and talk about a dark season.
Yeah.
And I was alone. I couldn't get my husband. The one time he doesn't answer his phone, I'm like calling him, like crying, like, what does this mean? Like, where's he going? We had no family around us. Everybody lived far away. And, I remember just feeling the heaviness of it felt very dark, and I didn't know what was going to happen.
Sure.
And the not knowing can be hard.
Yeah.
And I remember when he finally did pick up the phone, and we had to drive 3.5 hours to the hospital, and he met me there, and then they told us about his Down syndrome, and it felt like such a life sentence. It felt like this season isn't going to end.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, I remember that song coming into my head, Joy Comes in the Morning, Joy Comes in the Morning. And the beautiful thing about it is this baby that, all the doctors were telling us all the things he wouldn't be able to do and how many health issues he was going to have. And yes, we've gone through so much of that, but he has been the biggest blessing and source of joy for us and our older son. Like, he is just pure sunshine, and God he gave him to us because he knew we needed him. And, talking about comforting each other. And I think one thing that's important to recognize, and I'll say this really quickly too, is we all go through and walk through those seasons differently too. My way of coping, or my way of relating to God, or surviving, or whatever you want to call it, is going to look differently than someone else's. For him and I, we both were going through so many emotions. For him, he's like, I always tell him he's like my big teddy bear, but if you looked at him, he's a pretty intimidating, tall, big guy, So, it's like he always has to put on that facade. And for me, I was just immediately like breaking down and crying and just trying to work through it, And I remember looking at him and thinking, what, is this not affecting you? Are you not afraid? And feeling frustrated, and I think it's important to recognize that everyone's going to go through these times differently. But I love that you have this book that, is out there, that people can feel like even if they don't have that person to comfort them, that this book is a beautiful resource to comfort those who are going through those dark seasons. So how can people get this book, and how can people get in touch with you guys?
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, sure. Amazon is the best place to get the book. And if you just type in Before Dawn, it should be close to the top of the list, if not at the top of the list. So I encourage you to go there. And also, you can check out, you can also order the book via my website, Amazon, via my website at dustingeorge.com. You can find the blog there and all these posts that we were talking about earlier. And I'm most active on social over at Instagram, and that's at Dustin C. George. So, Rebecca?
Yeah. So I am similar on Instagram. That's the place where I'm the most active. So my account is Rebecca George. I'm a CCA Rebecca George author on Instagram. And I have a podcast as well. It's called the Radical Radiance Podcast, where we have weekly conversations that point listeners to what it looks like to radiate the heart of Jesus and all that they do. So feel free to check that out on your favorite podcast platform. And my book that we mentioned a couple of times that will be coming out in April is called You're Not Too Late, Trusting God's Timing in a Hurry Up World.
I cannot wait for this book.
Me too. So it will probably be available for pre-order as this episode is coming out. So feel free to hop on over to my account or my website and get in on any of the pre-order goodies that we do for it. So super excited about that.
I love it. I love it so much. And how neat that you guys are both authors. Like,
I
how cool.
know.
Is
So
that,
fun.
do you guys have like author talk and
Oh,
conversations?
yes. All the time.
All the
Lots of
time.
coffee dates talking about books and writing and all the things.
Oh, yes.
The
Yes.
time.
I love it. Well, this has been so much fun. You guys are both, what a blessing that you are, and so excited to continue watching what God is doing with both of your guys' work and your lives together and the impact that it's going to make. I'm honored that you guys could come on to The Sacred Hustle and share a little bit more of your story in the book. So thank you guys so much. This has been so
Thank you,
good.
Rachel.
Thanks for
Oh,
having
we've
us.
loved it.
Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the Sacred Hustle podcast. I hope it brought encouragement and inspiration to your day. If you love this conversation, I'd be so grateful if you'd share it with a friend, follow the show, and leave a rating or review. It helps more listeners find me. And don't forget, you can connect with me anytime at www.rachelherb.com. Until next time, keep balancing purpose, peace, and pursuit in your sacred hustle. See you soon.